Psychology says if you talk to yourself out loud, you're not losing it. You're actually engaging one of the most sophisticated cognitive tools your brain has access to. And if you've ever felt embarrassed catching yourself narrating your own actions, or muttering through a problem while you walk, or having full conversations with yourself in the car, this video will show you exactly what your brain is doing when you do that, and why people who talk to themselves are often operating at a level most people never access. This isn't about imaginary friends or hallucinations. This is about self-directed speech, which is a real psychological phenomenon that shows up in perfectly healthy, high-functioning adults. And the research on it is clear. People who talk to themselves aren't broken. They're processing. They're regulating. They're thinking out loud in a way that makes thinking itself more effective. So if you do this, the science is on your side. Let's break down what's actually happening. The first thing to understand is that talking to yourself activates multiple cognitive systems at once, and that's exactly why it works. When you think silently, your brain processes information through one channel. But when you speak out loud, even if you're the only one listening, you're engaging both your verbal production system and your auditory processing system. You're not just thinking the thought. You're saying it, hearing it, and then processing what you just heard. This creates a feedback loop that makes the information more concrete, more memorable, and easier to work with. Research from psychologist Gary Lupien at the University of Wisconsin found that people who talk to themselves while searching for objects in a supermarket found those objects faster than people who stayed silent. The act of saying the object's name out loud, apple, keys, cereal, made the brain's visual search more efficient. This wasn't because they were reminding themselves what they were looking for. It was because speaking activated the mental representation of the object in a way that silent thinking didn't. The word became a cognitive anchor. And that's what self-talk does across the board. It anchors abstract thoughts into something your brain can physically interact with. The second pattern is emotional regulation, and this is where self-talk starts looking less like a quirk and more like a deliberate mental strategy. When you're stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed, talking to yourself out loud gives your brain a way to externalize what's happening internally. Instead of emotion staying trapped inside as a vague feeling, you convert it into language. And language has structure, has logic, has a beginning and an end. That process alone reduces the intensity of what you're feeling because it moves the emotion from your limbic system, which handles raw emotional experience, into your prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and problem solving. There's a specific technique psychologists call distanced self-talk, and it's one of the most effective emotional regulation tools backed by research. Instead of saying I'm stressed, you say your own name or use the word you. John, you're feeling stressed right now, or you're overwhelmed, but you've handled this before. What happens when you do this is your brain starts processing the situation as if you're advising someone else instead of drowning in it yourself. Research from Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan showed that people who used distanced self-talk during stressful tasks performed better and felt less anxious than people who used first-person self-talk. The simple shift from I to you created psychological distance, and that distance gave them the clarity to respond instead of react. The third pattern is problem solving, and this is where people who talk to themselves pull ahead of people who don't. When you're trying to figure something out, keeping everything inside your head is like trying to hold a dozen objects in your hands at once. You can do it, but it's clumsy. Talking out loud is like setting those objects down on a table so you can see them all at the same time. You're externalizing the problem, and that makes it easier to manipulate, rearrange, and solve. Psychologist Adam Winsler studied children's use of private speech, which is what kids do when they narrate their own play or talk themselves through tasks. He found that children who used more private speech were better at self-regulation and performed better on tasks that required planning and focus. And here's the important part. Adults who talk to themselves are doing the exact same thing. They're using private speech to organize their thinking. They're walking themselves through steps. They're catching mistakes before they happen. They're giving themselves real-time feedback. When you say out loud, okay, first I need to do this, then I need to do that, you're not just reminding yourself of the steps. You're structuring your attention in a way that prevents distraction and keeps you moving in the right direction. The fourth thing worth understanding is that self-talk helps you stay on task in environments full of distractions. Your brain's attention system is constantly being pulled in different directions. Notifications, noises, intrusive thoughts, they're all competing for processing power. When you talk to yourself, you're creating an auditory anchor that keeps pulling your attention back to what you're supposed to be focused on. It's the difference between silently telling yourself to concentrate, which your brain can easily ignore, and saying it out loud, which your brain has to process as real sensory input. The act of hearing your own voice saying stay focused creates a stronger attentional signal than just thinking it. This is why people who work in high-focus environments like surgeons, pilots, and engineers often develop habits of talking themselves through procedures. It's not superstition. It's cognitive scaffolding. They're using their voice to build a structure around their attention that keeps it from collapsing under pressure. And if you've ever found yourself narrating what you're doing while you're doing something difficult, that's exactly what you were doing too. You were holding your own attention in place with language. Now here's where this starts connecting to identity. People who talk to themselves are often people who spend a lot of time alone, and there's a specific psychological reason why that's relevant. When you're around other people, your sense of self is constantly being shaped and reflected by social interaction. You know who you are because other people respond to you. But when you're alone for long stretches, that external feedback disappears. Self-talk becomes a way of maintaining a stable sense of self even when nobody else is around. You become both the speaker and the listener. You perform the role of the other person, and that keeps your internal dialogue active instead of collapsing into silence or rumination. Psychologists have found that people who are comfortable being alone tend to have rich internal dialogues. They're not lonely. They're self-sufficient in a cognitive sense. They don't need constant external validation because they've learned how to provide their own feedback loop. This doesn't mean they're antisocial. It means they've developed a form of mental autonomy that allows them to function independently without losing psychological coherence. And talking to yourself is one of the clearest signs that you've built that capacity. The other side of this is that people who talk to themselves tend to be more metacognitively aware. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. It's the ability to step back and observe your own mental processes instead of just being swept along by them. When you talk to yourself, you're narrating your thoughts in real time, and that narration forces you to be aware of what you're thinking, not just think it. You hear yourself say something out loud and immediately evaluate whether it makes sense, whether it's accurate, whether it's helpful. That's a level of self-monitoring most people never engage in because they never externalize their thoughts enough to examine them. The fifth pattern is that people who talk to themselves tend to have a different relationship with failure than people who don't. When something goes wrong, most people internalize it as a vague sense of being bad at things or not good enough. But people who talk to themselves externalize the problem immediately. They say it out loud. I messed that up. That didn't work. I need to try a different approach. And the act of saying it out loud transforms failure from an identity statement into a tactical observation. It's not I'm bad at this. It's that specific action didn't produce the result I wanted. That distinction matters more than most people realize. When you talk through failure out loud, you're engaging what psychologists call a growth-oriented attribution style. Instead of letting the failure collapse into shame or frustration that sits inside you unexamined, you're breaking it down into parts you can actually analyze. You're separating what you did from who you are. And that separation is what allows you to learn from mistakes instead of just feeling bad about them. People who stay silent when they fail tend to ruminate. The failure becomes a feeling that lingers without resolution. People who talk to themselves turn failure into data. They process it, extract the lesson, and move on faster because they've given the failure a beginning, middle, and end through language. The sixth thing is that self-talk helps you make decisions, especially when the decision is complicated or emotionally loaded. Silent deliberation often turns into circular thinking. You weigh the same options over and over without getting any closer to clarity. But when you talk through a decision out loud, you force your brain to commit to a sequence. You have to say one thing, then the next thing, then the next. You can't hold all the variables in your head simultaneously anymore. You have to lay them out in order, and that process of ordering reveals which option actually makes the most sense. Research shows that people who verbalize their decision-making process, even just to themselves, make better decisions than people who think silently. And it's not because they're smarter. It's because speaking forces clarity. When you hear yourself say the pros and cons out loud, you notice which arguments sound weak, which ones hold weight, which fears are legitimate and which ones are just noise. You're essentially putting your reasoning on trial in real time, and your own voice becomes both the prosecutor and the judge. That's a level of cognitive rigor most people skip because they never give themselves the chance to hear their own logic played back to them. The seventh pattern is that self-talk strengthens working memory. Working memory is your brain's ability to hold and manipulate information temporarily while you're using it. It's what allows you to follow a recipe, remember a phone number long enough to dial it, or keep track of multiple steps in a task. And working memory is limited. Most people can hold about 4 pieces of information at once before things start dropping out. But when you talk to yourself, you're offloading some of that cognitive load onto your auditory system. You're not just holding the information internally. You're saying it, hearing it, and using your voice as an external storage device that your brain can access on demand. Studies have shown that children who engage in more self-directed speech have better working memory performance than children who stay silent. And this effect doesn't disappear in adulthood. Adults who talk themselves through complex tasks perform better on those tasks because they're using language to extend their cognitive capacity. It's the difference between trying to juggle with 2 hands versus using a table to hold some of the objects while you work. The table doesn't make you a better juggler, but it makes the task more manageable. Your voice is the table. Now here's where it starts getting interesting in terms of social perception. People who talk to themselves in public are often viewed as strange, eccentric, or mentally unstable. And there's a reason for that bias. Society has normalized internal silence as the default mode of thinking, and anything that breaks that silence in a public setting gets flagged as abnormal. But that bias is based on outdated assumptions about what healthy cognitive functioning looks like. The reality is that people who talk to themselves in public aren't less stable. They're often more cognitively engaged than the people silently judging them. The stigma comes from conflating self-talk with a kind of disorganized speech that shows up in certain psychiatric conditions. But those are fundamentally different phenomena. Disorganized speech in conditions like schizophrenia is involuntary, fragmented, and disconnected from reality. Self-talk is deliberate, structured, and fully anchored in the present moment. It's goal-directed. It serves a function. The person talking to themselves knows exactly what they're doing and why. But because both involve speaking without an external audience, they get lumped together in public perception, and people who engage in healthy self-talk end up feeling embarrassed about something that's actually making them more effective. But here's where it starts affecting how you see yourself. If you internalize that stigma, if you start suppressing your self-talk because you're worried about being judged, you lose access to one of the most effective cognitive tools you have. You start forcing yourself to think silently even when speaking out loud would serve you better. And over time, that suppression doesn't just affect your thinking. It affects your confidence. Because when you silence yourself to avoid judgment, you're telling your brain that the way it naturally wants to process information is wrong. And that message, repeated over time, becomes a subtle form of self-distrust. The 8th pattern is that people who talk to themselves are often highly self-reliant, and that self-reliance comes from the same cognitive autonomy we talked about earlier. When you can narrate your own experience, guide yourself through problems, and provide your own feedback, you become less dependent on external validation or instruction. You don't need someone else to tell you what to do next because you've developed the capacity to tell yourself. And that capacity is rare. Most people have been conditioned to look outside themselves for direction, approval, and reassurance. People who talk to themselves have learned to generate those things internally. This doesn't mean they don't value other people or avoid collaboration. It means they're not helpless without external input. They can function independently because they've built an internal system that mirrors the support most people only know how to access externally. And that makes them resilient in ways that aren't immediately obvious. When circumstances isolate them, when they lose access to their usual support structures, they don't collapse. They keep narrating. They keep processing. They keep moving forward because the most important conversation they need to have, the one with themselves, is always available. The 9th thing, and this is something most people don't think about, is that self-talk reveals your internal belief system in a way silent thinking doesn't. When you think silently, your thoughts can stay vague, half-formed, unchallenged. But when you speak them out loud, even just to yourself, they become concrete. And once they're concrete, you can't ignore what they actually mean. If you catch yourself saying out loud, "I always mess this up," or "I'm never going to figure this out," you hear the absoluteness of those statements in a way you wouldn't if they stayed internal. And hearing them makes it harder to believe them without questioning them. This is why self-talk can be a tool for cognitive restructuring, which is a therapeutic technique used to challenge and change unhelpful thought patterns. When you hear yourself say something out loud that's distorted, exaggerated, or irrational, your brain has a chance to step in and correct it. You hear "I'm terrible at this" and immediately respond with, "No, that's not true. I did fine last time. I just made one mistake." That kind of self-correction happens much less frequently when thoughts stay silent because silent thoughts don't trigger the same evaluative response. Your brain treats spoken words as more real, more accountable, than unspoken ones. And that accountability is what makes self-talk such a powerful tool for mental health. The last thing to understand is that self-talk isn't just a cognitive tool. It's a form of self-relationship. The way you talk to yourself when nobody else is listening reveals how you actually feel about yourself underneath all the social performance. Are you kind? Are you critical? Are you patient? Or are you harsh? The tone you use, the words you choose, the way you frame problems and failures, all of that reflects the quality of the relationship you have with yourself. And most people never examine that relationship because they never externalize it enough to hear it clearly. If you talk to yourself the way you'd talk to someone you care about, that's a sign of self-compassion. If you talk to yourself the way a harsh parent or a critical boss would talk to you, that's a sign you're carrying internalized voices that aren't serving you. And the beautiful thing about self-talk is that once you notice the pattern, you can change it. You can consciously choose to speak to yourself differently. You can practice being kinder, more encouraging, more realistic. And over time, that external voice becomes internal. It rewires the way you think about yourself even when you're not speaking out loud. So if you talk to yourself, you're not weird. You're engaged. You're regulating. You're thinking at a higher level than most people ever reach. And if other people judge you for it, that says more about their discomfort with cognitive autonomy than it does about you. Keep narrating. Keep processing. Keep using your voice as the tool it is. If this helped you understand yourself better, consider subscribing for more psychology breakdowns like this.